about worship, we might only think about the songs that we sing at church. Is worship more than that, though? Is it more than just singing? Are there multiple ways to worship God? Is there a right way and a wrong way? Do some people's worship, like super holy people, like pastors and your small group leaders, get to God faster? Does God like certain types of worship more than others? These are all really awesome questions. They really make you think. So let's see what the writers of the Bible have in store for us today when it comes to this idea of worship. So today, as we head to the book of Mark, written by a Jesus follower named Mark, let's head to Mark 12:41 through 44, where he records a moment that happened between Jesus' disciples, and people giving their offering at a temple. So when Jesus came on the scene, he really stood out as someone who was doing something different than other leaders of that day. The things he was teaching in some areas were completely opposite of what the current religious leaders were teaching. Jesus let them know it too. The religious leaders wore clothes that matched their pride, puffy expensive coats and gold rings. See, they thought they were so smart. They tried to trick Jesus by asking him questions designed to trap him. But Jesus was pretty clever himself, being God and all. So here's one of those exchanges. The religious leaders sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus. They wanted to trap him with his own words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know you are a man of honor. You don't let other people tell you what to do or say. You don't care how important they are. But you teach the way of God truthfully. Is it right to pay the royal tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" Jesus knew what they were trying to do. So he asked, "Why are you trying to trap me? Bring me a silver coin. Let me look at it." So they brought the coin. He asked him, "Whose picture is this? And whose words?" "Caesar," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give back to God what belongs to God." They were amazed at him. See, Jesus knew the religious leaders were so puffed up with the pride they didn't want people to listen to anyone else except for them. Jesus even warned the crowds about them. "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in long robes. They like to be greeted with respect in the market. They love to have the most important seats in the synagogues. They also love to have the places of honor at dinners. They take over the houses of widows. They say long prayers to show off. God will punish these men very much." So Jesus didn't mess around. He told the religious leaders exactly what he thought. So you can only imagine how the religious leaders felt about Jesus. They didn't like him very much. So after this whole exchange with the religious leaders, Jesus and his disciples went and visited the temple. It was basically like this, like a church. So they sat near the place where offerings were collected and could see people coming, dropping off their offerings and leaving. Now understand that disciples were simple guys. Most of them were actually fishermen. Their clothes were most likely plain. Their robes probably had patches. Their sandals may even have been mended at some point. And they were definitely not rich and didn't have the clothes or the money to buy fine linens. Mark tells us that many rich people threw large amounts into them, meaning threw them in the offering boxes. I'm guessing that the disciples could tell that they were rich by the way they were dressed. Imagine someone walking into the room, maybe even clearing their throat so everyone would look at them, then striding to the offering box with gold chains tinkling on their clothing, then holding up a wad of cash and plunking it down in the offering box so everyone could hear exactly how much they were putting in. Jesus knew that these rich people were only there for the show, much like the religious leaders. They just wanted to flex in front of everyone, and they were really proud and wanted to show how important they were. He also knew that the money they were giving wasn't a whole lot. Giving $100 in the offering may seem like a lot, but not when you have $100,000 in your bank account. But then something caught Jesus' eye. An old woman, a widow. She didn't call attention to herself and her clothes weren't flashy. By the looks of her, she was probably pretty poor. She gingerly held out 2 small copper coins, pennies. She dropped the 2 pennies into the offering bucket with a small clink. Clink. Jesus immediately gathered his disciples around him and told them something that they really couldn't believe. He said, "What I'm about to tell you is true. That poor widow has put more into the offering box than all the others. The disciples were probably like, did you see that bag of cash the guy dropped in the box? What are you, nuts? It does seem odd that Jesus would think that 2 pennies was worth more than some rich dude throwing around hundreds in the temple, but Jesus was seeing something that the disciples weren't. Not what the money was worth, but what the money was worth to the people giving it. They all gave a lot because they are rich, but she gave even though she is poor. She put in everything she had. That was all she had to live on. So we need to understand something about women back in Jesus' time. Very, very few of them worked. Most of them stayed home and took care of the home and the family while the men earned money. This woman was a widow, meaning she had no husband. There was no real way for her to earn any money. Those 2 pennies were very likely among the last pennies that she had to give. And instead of keeping it for herself to use for, food, she decided to give it to God. What she gave was worth more than what the others gave simply because it was worth more to her. It cost her more. Think of it this way. If you got $100 as a gift on your birthday and your friend asked for a $1 bill to buy a Coke, you'd think, sure, no problem. But if you got $1 for your birthday and that same friend asked to borrow $1 to buy a Coke, you think, yeah, no, this is all I have. I've got a lot of stuff, don't I? Give me 1 second. I feel much better. See, I could have all of that stuff, all the clothes, all the riches, all the money, a fishing pole, but if it all is just for show, if it's just a brag, if it's just a flex for those around me, showing them just how amazing I am, then God's really not interested. The rich men, like the religious leaders, were concerned with what things looked like on the outside. But the poor widow, who had almost nothing, chose to give everything. Jesus saw her heart and knew that her pennies were worth far more than the rich man's gold. So now you might be wondering something. Weren't we talking about worship before this story? What does worship have to do with this story of the widow? She didn't even sing any songs. And you might already know this, but worship is way more than singing a song. You can actually worship God with your actions, your words, and your whole life. So how exactly does that apply to you? We know God's pleased when we do things, both with our words and actions, that show how much we love Him and love others. And really, Jesus gave us the best example of what that looks like. He lived His whole life doing things that pleased God. For us, I think we struggle when there isn't immediate feedback. Some kind of reward. The art of service, random acts of kindness, doing things for others for no reason. It's kind of a lost art. But if you get this, really get it, you'll be changing not only your own lives, but the lives of those around you. So before you do something, anything really, stop and ask yourself if it's going to honor God. It only takes a moment, but it could potentially help you make a wise choice, not to mention stopping you from doing something not so smart. So before we go, I want you to think about this question. How can you live for God? Big actions, small actions, with words or deeds, what can you do? Don't worry if you're struggling to come up with ideas. That's okay. Just take one small step.